Hello. This is episode 12 of the Hate Crime Files, a podcast about crimes typically involving violence motivated by prejudice based on race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or other grounds. I'm your host, Terrence Heath. This podcast covers disturbing events and may not be suitable for everyone. It is not recommended for children under 13. Listener discretion is advised. By now, the details of Matthew Shepard's death are well known. On October 6, 1998, 21-year-old Matthew met Russell Henderson and Aaron McKinney at a bar in Laramie, Wyoming, and accepted a ride from them. Henderson and McKinney beat, tortured, and robbed Matthew, tied him to a wooden fence, and left him for dead, all because he was gay. Matthew lingered in a coma for several days as news of the brutal attack on him spread worldwide. On October 12, 1998, Matthew Shepard died without ever regaining consciousness. I remember where I was when I heard about Matthew Shepard. I was working at the National Minority AIDS Council at the time in the policy department. I'd just done a brief stint as the assistant editor at the Lambda Book Report, and before that I worked at the Human Rights Campaign, the job that brought me to Washington, D.C. At that point, I'd spent the early years of my career practically immersed in LGBT issues and related matters. At the time, I was on my first work-related trip in that job, helping my boss to organize and manage a training on HIV/AIDS treatment advocacy for Latinx and Indigenous women in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We were in flight between D.C. and New Mexico when the news first broke about Matthew being attacked, beaten, and left for dead. I didn't hear the story until I turned on the news while settling into my hotel room. I remember feeling shock and horror as I sat there on my bed, hearing about how Matthew had been found, bloodied, beaten, and tied to the fence outside Laramie, Wyoming. The story unfolded over the next several days that Matthew was likely attacked because he was gay. During every break in the training, I went back up to my hotel room to check the news for updates on Matthew's condition. I didn't know Matthew personally, of course, but his story gripped me because I knew how easily it could have been me or someone I knew and cared about. The emails and messages I kept getting from friends in the days that followed showed I wasn't the only one touched by Matthew's story. I remember sitting in my hotel room and absorbing the news that Matthew had died after spending his last days in a coma as a result of the beating he received. I remember sitting alone, feeling a leaden weight in the pit of my stomach and hot tears on my face. I wanted very badly to be with my friends at that time, to be with people who felt the way I did at that moment. The evening I flew back to Washington, there was a massive demonstration and vigil for Matthew at the Capitol building. My friends and I made plans to attend. We stood among hundreds, if not thousands, of people, all there to remember Matthew and demand action on hate crimes. This week marked the 21st anniversary of Matthew's death. Since the details of Matthew Shepard's murder are widely known and readily available to anyone who wants to look them up, I wanted to do something a little different from the usual narrative for this episode. Fortunately, I had the chance to sit down and talk with Veronica Kennedy, who was a classmate of Matthew's at their boarding school in Switzerland, to learn more about who Matthew was and what he meant to those who knew him well. What follows is our discussion. So I have the pleasure of actually speaking with someone who knew Matthew Shepard. I wanted to do something a little different for this episode of the podcast because so many people know Matthew's name and the details of what was done to him.
Absolutely.
And so I didn't want to rehash all of that. Like I said earlier, one of the things I find in researching these stories is that who the victim was gets lost. It becomes more the story of what happened to them and what happened after that.
Yeah, they become almost an effigy of themselves.
And it's important for me, as much as I can in doing these episodes, to bring back as much as I can find out or learn about that person, who they were, what their family was like, how they grew up. I don't usually have a chance to talk to someone who knew them. And so when my friend Mindy put me in touch with you, I thought, wow, okay, this will be different. So I'm speaking with Veronica Kennedy.
Hi.
Who was a friend of Matthew Shepard's. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
So, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to come and share Matt's story with you and who he was. And you're quite right. It's funny ever since, well, not funny, but it's ever since Matt's murder, every time I see reports of a hate crime, I immediately think about the people that were like me, like his family, like his other friends, who are discombobulated is the word I keep coming back to. I've come back to over the years. At the life that crime takes on of itself, right? And that the person who was the victim of the crime becomes, like I was saying earlier, like an effigy of themselves. First of all, like, I don't know Matthew Shepard, right? Like, I know Matt. I knew Matt so there's a bit of a backstory. Matt and I met at a boarding school in Switzerland.
Ah, okay.
Right. And we were all kind of thrown into this scenario where our parents, for one reason or another, had need for an American education for their kids. And so they sent us to this place. And I met Matt in German class in 1993. Okay. I was 13 years old. He was, I believe, a junior. And it was a very, very small school. I think the entire student body at that point was and this was a school that was from 7th grade to 12th grade. And I think the entire student body was maybe 300 students, maybe. And so we were in a class of 4 people. We were also heavily involved in the school's theater program together, such as it was, right? Like, it was a theater program that was largely a black box style theater, but it was all, sort of a small crew. And we became friends, right? Like, was I his bestest friend ever? No, not at all. There were certainly those who were his peers and his classmates and his dorm mates and his roommates with whom he had, closer, different relationships. But he was someone who was very much part of my childhood, very much, for the 2 years that he was there. And in the aftermath of his murder, took on a completely different role in my life. It was a school where everybody, it was such a cross section of the world that went to the school. There were people who were high society, Middle Eastern, sort of Arab princes style, right? And then there were the children of just wealthy business people. There were civil servants, children of civil servants. I was there because of my parents' work in the U.S. Foreign Service, and we were stationed in Poland at the time. Okay. And not so much, and the town that we were in didn't have an American school. So and then we had people that were under like Matt's category, who were people that were working American expats working out of the Middle East, out of Saudi Arabia. And we called them the Saudi Aramco kids. So he was part of that Saudi Aramco kid crowd, and I was part of sort of the diplomat brat crowd. But it was sort of just an origin point. It was never a clique. Like
Right.
there were. It wasn't a very clique environment. Certainly, people gravitated towards people that knew each other, and so the Americans all kind of fell in with one another. And so the group of friends, the larger group of friends, were people that were older, younger, because there were so few people at the school. So we did have like an intimate friendship, but we were kids.
Yeah.
Right? So but there was so much, in the aftermath, there was so much about him that none of us knew. Like, none of us knew he was gay at school.
Right.
And it's not that it was a suspicion or anything. It was just not something that we ever talked about as a broader student body. Yeah.
And I can imagine, I mean, at that time being careful about who you would, want to come out to. And it's a process, so I don't know where he might have been in that process.
Yeah. I think that's true. When the attack came out after his murder, that he had been attacked during a student trip in Marrakesh, and none of us knew about it. Nobody knew about it except for the people that were also on the trip with him. But I don't think they really understood what would happen, because remember, we're all 16, 17, 15 years old.
Right.
And so there's a rose-colored lens that you kind of look at the world in, especially when you're in this absolutely bucolic place. Like, I mean, it's I went to Hogwarts. It's nestled in the Swiss Alps, in the southern canton of, the Italian canton of Switzerland. The buildings are stunning. You're 45 minutes north of Milan. Like, you just kind of exist in a different world. And very cognizant of the opportunities that we were given there, right? But at the same time, we were teenagers.
Right.
So, who was Matt? He was a guy. He was a kid. He was a very warm person. He was very generous of spirit. He was not quiet. Like, he wasn't a quiet, shy guy. But at the same time, he was thoughtful. Like, he would participate and hang out and be very much part of every active conversation. But at the same time, he would sort of sit back and just listen. He was someone who... It's funny because in the this year marks the year that he's been gone as long as he was alive.
Right.
And it's made me think back on how much of him do I actually remember, right? And how much of it is sort of blown up in my mind as a result of the effigy of Matthew Shepard, right? And how much of it is just memory taking its course and the stories becoming, bigger, smaller, less detailed, more detailed in different ways.
What takes on more significance in retrospect. And the things that ring true are that he, my freshman year, I had sustained a pretty bad knee injury, really bad, like bad crutches for months and months and months. And he would help me with my books to the next class after our class. And it was across campus. It wasn't a huge campus, but it was an extra step that he would take on to help me. I was a very precocious. I can imagine people giggling and rolling their eyes as I say this. I was super chatty as a kid. And I still am today. But he was one of the people that had a lot of patience for me. So he was
he was a guy, right? Like he was it. If Matt were here today, he would be a guy, a person, someone who I think stands out in people's minds, certainly, but also someone who could just as easily be, a person just living their life.
Do you have a favorite memory of Matthew?
Okay, so this is gonna sound super bougie. At school, we had after Christmas break, we would all come back. The school would come back together at a Swiss ski resort.
Okay.
Where we would have what was called "quote unquote" ski term, and it was 3 weeks, and it was basically classes in the morning and then skiing in the afternoon. And at the end of this, and the kids that didn't know how to ski learned how to ski, and the kids that knew how to ski, skied all day.
Right.
I learned to ski at 12 years old, and that's actually what tore my knee up. The first year, I don't know if he knew how to ski walking into this, but he decided to participate in what we called the Fleming Cup, which was sort of a friendly intramural competition. That was a slalom course, giant slalom course. Matt went, instead of going around the slalom course like you're supposed to, decided he wanted to go super fast, at least this is how he told it later, and just went straight down the hill on a pair of skis. And by the end of it, it was like, ah! And it became, pictures in the yearbook about it. He went straight down, barreling forward. And that's actually something about him. He was pretty fearless, right? Here's a kid who came up in Wyoming.
There was an adventurous side.
And always up for, hey guys, what are we doing? Whether it was going downtown or going to, Milan, because why not? You're 45 minutes north.
Right. And
really embracing the opportunities to see everything. Where he had tremendous curiosity about the world around him. And he to go down hills, and we're like, dude, you're gonna break your face, what are you doing?
I'm just thinking, that at that age when you're discovering so much about yourself, to also be in that setting where you have access to or exposure to so many different places and things.
Especially and my experience with that, so I didn't actually live in the States until I was 17 years old, say for I think 9 months when I was 9, something like that. And he was the exact opposite, right? They lived in Wyoming their whole life. And then when Dennis got the gig with I can't remember if it was one of the airliners or it was one of the oil companies, but regardless,
I think it was an oil company.
Yeah, I think it was Aramco. They went from Wyoming to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Boy, oh boy, that culture shock was something. I'm sure. And then from there, because there was no, so the schooling situation was American schooling stopped at 10th grade. That's how they did things. And the kids would then go on to different schools worldwide. And to go from Wyoming to Saudi Arabia and then Switzerland. Right? Talk about access and curiosity and all of the things. And he embraced it. He was always curious, always asking questions, and always up for something new. He really did have an adventurous spirit about him.
Do you remember the last time you saw him?
Yes.
It's probably kind of far back. But...
And, it's funny because, the last time I saw him was during, the after the attack in Marrakesh. I remember not seeing him for a while and being confused for where he was.
Right.
And my guidance counselor at school was also the school nurse. And I was very, very, I called the woman Mom. Her name is Ellen.
And I'm guessing you didn't know about the attack at that time.
Nobody did. And save for obviously the faculty, right? And the kids that were also on this trip with him. And I remember people being very silent about why Matt wasn't there.
Okay.
And I remember asking, like, did something happen? You know, when you have that many teenagers together, you know, obviously shit goes down. Right? And so was it, you know, did he get expelled? Did he get suspended? Did something happen? Was he ill? And I remember the teachers being very guarded about why he wasn't there anymore. And then he came back for, I think, the last month of school so that he could graduate with everyone. And there were details in there that I actually didn't remember until this last summer. Last year I went back for my 20th high school reunion at Tassis. And one of my closest friends in the world, he's like my big brother, was one of Matt's roommates. And you did a tour, right? Like we did tours around campus to see what was new, what was old, and, you know, sort of an alumnus tour, right?
Yeah.
And one of the rooms we went to was their old room.
Oh, wow.
And it was watching him in this place unlocked. Again, it sort of like clicked the lock and all of these other memories came through. And I remember the last time I saw him was before I left school, because graduation would usually happen right around the time everybody took off for the summer. And it was within the context of me saying goodbye to him and the two of his roommates that were like my older brothers. And it was sad, but it was always like this idea of, I'll see you sometime. We'll run into each other. I mean, and this is years before the internet. Email had just become a thing. And you know, if social media were what it was today, yeah, absolutely, I would have been more in touch with him. But he'd gone off to college, and I didn't really think about him until the day I saw the news.
So, I'm going to come to that in a little bit, but what do you remember most about Matthew?
He was so small.
He was like 5'2".
Teeny weeny. And it's funny that hasn't been more part of the Matthew story.
Barely 100 pounds.
He was teeny weeny.
Yeah.
Teeny tiny, but like small in stature, big in size. And not like an overtly boisterous personality, but certainly someone that you forget that he was 5'2", and he always his smile was as big as his face, and he had on top of that he had like a mouthful of metal. He had a lot of braces. He had braces. And those physical attributes of him I remember really clearly. He was so small. His clothes, I feel like he would wear clothes that I feel like were too big for him to try and look bigger.
When I watched the documentary, Matt Shepard is a friend of mine, I thought, you know, when I looked at him, I was like, he's swimming in his clothes.
He's teeny tiny.
I'm like, his jeans were hanging off of him. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, he was little.
Yeah.
And he often had like, he had this thing where he would wear mismatched socks all the time. And
on purpose or by accident? Or?
He says on purpose. I think it's because he missed laundry day, frankly. But when we would do theater, you know, when we would do theater productions together, he would always like pull little pranks, and we had like this prank night that we would do during productions. But he would always like be kind of a trickster and do stuff like wear mismatched socks just to annoy the crap out of everybody, because we'd look at him and be like, dude, what the hell is wrong with you? Put on some damn socks. And and what else do I remember? We were also in choir together, and I remember he would sing very quietly because we had some people, and a mutual friend was a woman named Haley who has a voice like an angel.
Okay.
And we would hear her sing, and all of us would be like, and he, again, like this small person in height, but like just, and those are one of the memories that for me has been hard to reconcile across the years because, Matt wore suits that were easily 3 sizes too big for him. And we had a school dress code. So like no jeans and t-shirts. You had to be like buttoned up, well dressed for class, all of those things. And maybe looking a little rumpled. Maybe he needed to press his shirts more often than not. But he was a teenager.
Yeah,
he was
a teenage boy.
16, 17-year-old boy. Yeah. And how much of that do I remember against the sort of the hugeness of what Matthew became, right? And I mean, for me, Matthew Shepard, like if you think in the last part of the 20th century, who are the 2 gay hate crimes that people remember? Harvey Milk and Matthew Shepard. And so when you're thinking about, for me to reconcile, like, do I really remember that, or is that in contrast to Matthew?
Right.
Like,
there's your friend Matt, and then there's Matthew Shepard, who, for many of us, became a symbol of sorts.
Yeah, and Matthew for me did as well. I'm openly bi, and until Matt was murdered, it didn't even occur to me that someone would want to kill me because of my sexual identity. I grew up in a world where apartheid was very real, and because that was very much in the headlines, Bosnia headlines, Berlin Wall. I mean, I moved to Poland right I can't remember, but right around the fall of the wall. So like those big like issues that typically drive people to, get nasty with each other. Were the ones that stood out in my head. It never occurred to me that homophobia could be as dangerous as religious intolerance or racism. Like it had just never occurred to me. So yeah, Matthew also became a clarion call for me as well, and realizing that, oh God, people will do this to each other. And I know I sound totally Pollyanna when I say that, but it's something that had never occurred to me before.
How did you learn about what happened to Matthew?
So it was October 10th, 1998. I was home. I was in college at the time. And I was home, like, working on a paper. I was at one of the local schools, one of the local community colleges. And I remember being like, oh God, I'm going to miss this paper deadline. Right? Furiously working on last minute homework because I'm a procrastinator. And I was listening, I had the news on in the background. And I looked up just as Andrea Roan on Channel 9 was reporting on an attack on a young man in Wyoming. And I looked up, and in sort of the inset, right above their shoulder, I see a picture. And I'm like, he looks really oh gosh, that looks a lot like Matt. Wow, that's crazy. And she said Matthew Shepard. And again, I don't know him as Matthew.
Right.
I know him as Matt.
Right.
And I'm like, wow, what are the odds? I should look him up and see where he is these days. And then I don't know what picture they showed. I think it was, you know what? I remember now. It was the picture of Matt in the tan blazer with the jean shirt under it, because he thought it looked really cool, and it clicked into place, and I started, my blood ran cold.
Oh my gosh.
And I just started screaming, and I was like, what the? Right? And I started screaming for my mother, And Jesus, 21 years ago, and it still puts a lump in my throat. And my mom was convinced that this was a misunderstanding, that no, this isn't the kid that you went to school with. Come on, Veronica, what are the odds? And I called the school, and they confirmed that it was him. And it became, finding out on the news and then immediately calling people.
Right.
Right, again, because this is before the internet had really taken on.
I'm guessing you probably talked to a lot of the other people that knew.
Oh yeah.
Matthew and remembered him.
And we were all bewildered. There was, there's a pretty large contingency of alumnus here in the DC area, and we were trying to get a hold of people were just trying to get a hold of each other to understand what happened, and one of my best friends, who now lives in DC and who happens to also be named Veronica, was in Italy at the time. She was going to school there. And I called her and I was like, dude, have you heard the news? And she's like, Veronica, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in every newspaper. It's in every country. It's everywhere about Matt. And I'm like, what the fuck is happening? What happened? And it was just so bewildering because, for that, I think for anybody to find out, the shock of that happening to someone you knew and was very much a part of who you were.
Right.
To find out about that and then find out that you're not even going to be able to catch breath. Because it's everywhere. And immediately sort of the media frenzy of it took over.
And before you've had a chance to absorb it suddenly, I can only imagine this person that you knew and loved as a friend, suddenly they belong to the world.
Yeah, and it was also it wasn't even the shock, it was of him being gay, right? Like, so poor Matt, he was out to the people that he kept in contact with, after they all graduated, but wasn't out to like everybody. And I think he was, as I understand it, and I might have this wrong, he was starting to really come out as he understood and embraced who he was.
I think that night he'd gone to a lesbian gay student union meeting.
And he was really starting to embrace who he was as a gay man. So to find out, my friend who, okay, cool. I remember looking at the screen and the television screen and them saying, it's suspected that it's a gay hate crime or something to that effect. And me saying, wait, first of all, Matt was gay? Oh, okay. Didn't realize it. And secondly, so what if he was gay?
Right.
Lots of people, and again, it was that innocence, right? Like, it was that innocence. I'm like, lots of people are gay. Why would anybody want to kill him for that? And that confusion for me was really terrifying, because I'm like, wait a second, I am attracted to men and women. Does that mean people want to kill me too? Oh God. Right. Oh God. Right. And so it was a lot happening very quickly, and I remember my parents finally turning off the television and being like, go to bed. You need to not be in front of a screen. Right. And it was just really kind of a blur. And, the subsequent years, I've thought back on that moment and been like, girl, boss up. If that was hard for you, what do you think it was like for Judy and for tennis and for Logan?
I can't even imagine.
Yeah. And it was rugged. It was rugged.
Yeah,
it was really rugged.
Being a parent myself, I can only imagine how incredibly hard that would have to have been for them.
Oh yeah.
Did you have any contact with his parents in the days after that?
No, not really. A bunch of us went. A bunch of us, and by us I mean TASA students. Went to the funeral. I had intended to go, and funny you talk about parents, because I was really pissed at my parents for years. But now as a parent, I understand why they ultimately pulled the plug on it and said, no, you're not going. Because, again, my parents, foreign service officers, we live in a very secure, grew up in a very security aware world, and they I'm sure they saw the protests.
Yeah.
And they saw, on top of that, watching their child just I was in a haze. And then fly out there. There's instant communication wasn't what it is today.
Right.
And they were terrified for my safety.
Yeah.
And
I can imagine.
Yeah. And so I ended up not going. And the first time I saw Judy was years later. It was at a I want to say it was at like a presentation of the Laramie Project. And I didn't know, because we were boarding students, right? We would sort of be aware of each other's parents. But it was, I remember seeing the Shepards at school. I remember Judy and Dennis. But Judy was right. He was his mom. She was his mom. And seeing her years later and just almost in awe of this woman, right? Like, here's a woman that has made it her purpose in life to make sure that no other mom has to go through it. And I won't profess that I know her well at all, but in the years that I've been around her and come in contact with her and always within the auspices of this, she is someone who, like, I don't know how she does it. I don't know how she does it.
I mean, you put one foot in front of the other, but that's all I can say.
I mean, like, and the, it's just I think about, like, someone who's getting ready in the morning as you're getting ready for work.
Right.
And looks over, you look over your agenda, or you look over your to-do list, and it's every day.
Yeah.
I'm going to go talk about my kid's murder.
Yeah.
Oh.
That just, I mean, from my experience of grief, it's not something and I can only imagine from losing a child, it's not something you ever get past or get over.
Yeah.
You move forward and you learn to carry it with you.
Yeah.
But I just don't know how.
I don't know how.
I mean, you find it, I guess, in you. You rise to whatever the circumstances are. But that is something that both Matt's parents, it kind of just amazed me, the way that they threw themselves into making a difference in his honor. Why do you think Matthew's murder had such an impact on people everywhere?
I don't know. I don't know. I really, I've in trying to make peace with it in the subsequent years, I've often posed that question to myself, and for a number of years after Matt's murder, I mean, I had sort of my close-knit group of friends who knew, and some of whom came out to me actually in the aftermath of his murder. And I didn't really talk about it after then, so I didn't really even start to contemplate why Matt for years. I was just like, it's here, I'm not ready to deal with it. I'm not ready to deal with, like, the crazy that happens anytime that it comes up, because it was still so sensationalized up to, I think, probably about 5 years was when it started to really calm down. And I don't know. I mean, why Matt? Why was Matt the fire that was lit under our collective ass? I don't know. I think some of it is that Matt ultimately had a loving family, right?
Right.
That, right, there's a line in the movie, Matt Shepard's a friend of mine, which was actually made by a classmate of ours, Michelle. And when she, at one point, Judy says, I mean, he wanted to be Dolly Parton for Halloween one year. Like, I had an idea.
I love that.
I had an idea. And he wandered around in a Wonder Woman cape. Like, I had a thought.
I have to admit, when that part of the documentary, I loved that. I was like, okay, this sounds like a guy I could hang out with.
Yeah, no, right. Like, and he was a goof. He was a goofball. And so I think some of it is that he had parents who, unlike so many kids, who, okay, you're gay, fine, whatever. Yeah, we know. So I think some of that was the tragedy of it. I think some of it was there were, the other things that occurred that summer, and that were going on in the summer of '98.
Right. That summer was also when James Byrd, the man whose name is also on the hate crimes bill, along with Matthew, I remember vividly.
Yeah.
Those two events.
And so there were two really brutal events occurring in one summer, autumn, that were both very clear and distinct hate crimes. And I think it was a zeitgeist of 24-hour news coming into play, and so like it never really got out of anybody's head that this had happened. I think also some of it was, Hollywood was starting to come out, right? Like famously, Ellen DeGeneres came out not long before, and then this happens.
Right.
And so I think it was just like a confluence of things. And and then in the subsequent years, just the work that the foundation has done, that the Matthew Shepard Foundation has done. But one clear reason, I don't know, at the risk of sounding hyperbolic, I think some of it's also just the sense of, Matt had a very strong sense of what's fair. Like if something wasn't fair, that was like one of the few things I can remember, like his dander getting up, right? An otherwise relatively happy person. And I think maybe that some of that sense of unfairness is him in there still.
I know for me, when I first heard the news, I was all the way in New Mexico on a training, work-related training on HIV/AIDS advocacy, and I didn't hear the news until I got out there, and I kept going up to my room to watch the news, to check updates, but all of my friends on email and online, this was all that any of us talked about, and people were calling to check on each other, and I could see in Matt a lot of the people that I knew and cared about, and I think Matt, coming from this very solid, loving family, very I don't know, seemed like a middle class background. I think there was the sense that, well, if anybody should be safe, it should be someone like him, and if this can happen to someone like him, then it can happen to anybody. But I do think that the increased visibility of the LGBT community, like you said, and the 24-hour news made a big difference.
Oh yeah, and we also had like new toyitis with the internet at that point, right? Like everything was on AOL.
Yeah.
Everything, right? Like and I think that was I think that was one of the areas where the constant conversation about it, about his murder, about his attack, was what brought on the frenzy. And it was, but again, that still doesn't fully answer the question, for me at least, because James Byrd had happened. So why Matt and not James?
And like I read that 30 other murders similar like that had happened that were hate related or hate motivated, had happened that year, but this was just the one that gripped the public imagination. Maybe it was a perfect storm of having someone who was a very sympathetic victim as well. I mean, I didn't know Matt, but I would look at him in the pictures of him and see, this slight person that, your first urge would be to like protect him somehow, So I think that, that may have been a part of it, but also that people maybe could see their family members and friends in him as well, in a way that made a wide impact.
Yeah, I think that's certainly some of it too. And I think why his story has endured so much. And that, for me, in the years that have passed since, it's been hard to reconcile. I realized that I didn't really start reconciling it until about 5 or 6 years ago, and trying to make peace with a lot of good has come from it, right? And I'm hesitant to talk about it in those terms because I don't want to martyr him any more than he's already been martyrized.
Right.
Because I don't want people to lose who Matt was.
Right.
But, I feel like so much good has happened for the LGBT community, for just tolerance in general as a result of his murder. There have been, huge gains in progress for the LGBT community.
What do you think Matthew would think if he could see how much has changed in the 21 years since his death?
Frankly, I think he would have been part of it if he had been alive. And I think that I think it would give him some peace. Anytime I see on Facebook or in the news something that has had an impact as a result of his murder. This last year, there was the legislation that was passed in New York that removed the gay panic argument.
Yeah.
And that was directly related to the attack on Matt. I just remember thinking to myself, like, man, I hope you have a front seat for all the good that's happened as a result of you,
and all the changes that have occurred. Because I think what happened to him inspired a lot of people to speak up. Yeah. And to tell their own stories. Yeah. I mean, part of the reason I'm doing this podcast is because of what happened to Matt, and it spurred my interest in hate crimes and researching all of the cases that I can find and documenting them somehow, so that Matthew is a symbol, but I feel like he would probably say, yeah, but there's other people's stories. I think, absolutely. There's other people's stories that need to be told as much.
Absolutely. As much. I think that's very true. And it's, the I think everybody that has come in contact with Matt, who then became Matthew, has come to that conclusion as well. Like, look, we are people who knew flesh and blood, the person, braces and mixed match socks and all.
Warts and all.
Right. And for us, it's been, why Matt? I think we've made peace with it enough. But why hasn't there been, this past year, there have been hundreds of hate crimes perpetrated against transgendered individuals. Yeah. And especially of color.
20 murders this year.
That we know of. That have surfaced up in
that have been reported.
Yeah. And, why wasn't there just a global clarion call about each and every one of them? Why wasn't there, a level of response. Because those people who were attacked, who were murdered, they're not any less unique a human being to their family circles, to their spheres of influence, right? And I think they deserve, in terms of, if we're talking about progress forward, they deserve as much of a loud platform as Matthew Shepard, the effigy of Matthew Shepard has received.
I think that's part of what I admire about what his parents have done, is using that platform to keep the focus and awareness out there, that this impacts a lot of people. And, for me, it's like 21 years after Matthew Shepard, we should know by now what hatred does.
Right.
But lo and behold, we still have all of these things going on.
Yeah.
I guess, trying to think, Matthew would be almost 42. He'd be closing
42.
in on 42.
Yep. 42 on
December
1st. World AIDS Day. World Day, yeah.
Because it was just shy of his 22nd birthday. What do you think he'd be doing now?
I think he'd be a teacher, or I don't think he'd be doing any one thing. He, just the curiosity the sort of curiosity that he had about the world about him makes me think that he would have done, maybe he had bonded actually very closely to one of the teachers at school who was his English teacher, and I wonder if he wouldn't have become like a boarding school teacher, right? Just to have the opportunity to be able to engage and interact with kids from all over the world. I think he would have done that. I think he would have been involved in theater. I think he would have been involved in absolutely the LGBT community and fighting for equality there. Whether that's in one career or it was, sort of a confluence of things, I don't know. But I do, he had the kind of personality that just kind of drew you in a very comfortable way that you would want a teacher to have. Or a counselor. I think he would have been a good guidance counselor as well. Yeah, I think something like that.
What would you, people know a lot of the details about, what happened to Matthew. That's all out there for anyone who wants to find that information. But what would you want people, what would you most want people to know about Matthew?
That he was it sounds trite, but that he was a person, right? That he wasn't a saint, he wasn't a devil, right? That he was as human and as as unremarkable and at the same time remarkable as you and me.
Right.
That he was interested in being good and being fair and being someone who shares a lot of the same kinds of qualities that I think everybody does, right? Like he was a person. He was he was, multifaceted. He was not one thing to everyone. He was a lot of things to a lot of people. And that that he was just a guy. Someone who I think if anyone were to meet them, they would be like, which one's Matt? Oh, the guy with the goose honk laugh. He's really funny. I like that guy. Like he's yeah.
I don't know what, your beliefs are in terms of like afterlife, hereafter, afterlife, or anything like that. But wherever Matthew is right now, far from the troubles of our everyday world, wherever Matthew is right now, what would you want him to know?
That he lit a fire under the world's ass like most people haven't seen.
That he made a difference.
He made a difference, and I think he gave a sense of purpose to people that I don't think any of us would have otherwise. I didn't talk about Matt for a long time. I don't think I don't think any of us could talk about it for a while. Outside of like each other, right? Because we do, the students, it's a very active alumnus community. We're all pretty tight. And there's an experience share there that like if I met another person who was also alumnus from TASIS, there's an immediate connection there, right? And so we talk about it amongst each other and remember him when we were together. But what it did do for me was make me say, okay, this is not going to happen to anybody else on my watch. I need to do everything I can. And so I became someone who stands up, right? And so I think I would want him to know that he what was done to him wouldn't be in vain. It wouldn't be just down the darkness of, well, another kid got killed, damn, right? Like, it became something.
Did you go to the internment?
I was there with my so I'm a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence.
Okay, yes.
And I did not go in face, but I was there with my sisters. They came with me. And that was... Yeah. Yes, short answer is that, yeah, I was there. And that was insane. It was crazy. It was funerals, and it was there was a lot of closure in there for me because I couldn't go to the original funeral. So there was a lot of closure there. And one that reminded me that ultimately the enduring memory of Matt is just unbreakable bonds of friendship that he has in his life and in his afterlife. And it was pretty insane to see this tiny little box up on the dais and looking at that and saying, oh God, man.
Right. And that he's finally finally has a resting place.
Yeah, and that I didn't, it's funny when the details that, you don't learn until much later. I didn't know that they didn't bury him, that they, for the sake of protection. Right. And that hit me on a completely different level, right? Like at this point, I've had my son, I'm a parent. Right. And that you can't put your kid to rest because you're terrified of what's going to happen to his remains. Right. Like, those poor parents. Yeah. And that they just deal with it with such grace and such poise that I just, wow. But now that he's safe and he's at rest, in a place where he's absolutely a part of the national landscape now. And that, I think, has been one of the things to...
And finally safe.
Yeah, and safe. And that the national landscape is such that we as a culture can offer him a place of safety. Was all of these things are sort of whirling around in my head during that service. It was a very special, somber, sad, but also very comforting day.
Is there anything else that I didn't ask that you wanted to share or bring up?
No. It's just keep doing what you're doing. This podcast is interesting. What you're doing here to try and make it to surface up who the person behind the crime is and was and is for so many. I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, but I can't imagine I'm the only person in the world that goes, what? No, what? That's not their name. What? And that you want to learn more about the person, I think is it's comforting.
Well, I like to think, and I hope that Matthew is at peace now.
I think he is.
I think that, hopefully he can rest knowing that he's had a huge impact. And that so many people remember him.
Yeah. I think he's at peace, and I think he's also kind of $20, he's somewhere up there going, that's right, you're not going to do that to anybody else. Like every time that there's another change made, every time that there's more progress, every time that there is something good that comes from Matt's murder, I often will sort of, just kind of point up to the sky and go, man, I hope you have a front seat for this. Godspeed. Like, just Godspeed. Because I think that one of the things that has been why he has been such a force for good is not only the work that his family has done, and that whole family is invested in the work of the foundation, and friends and but also I think a lot of it is that enduring spirit of generosity, of wanting to give back, and wanting to just make things better. I'd like to believe that is also a driving force of just his own strength of spirit.
All right. Well, thank you.
Of course.
So much for coming out and talking to me. And
for the folks at home, we've had this conversation in this beautifully sun-filled room with beautiful, greenery and this just lovely place. Thank you for doing this here. It's very comforting to be able to do this in a place that's so lovely.
Well, thank you. The Hate Crime Files podcast is researched, written, produced, and hosted by Terrence Heath. That's me. Thanks for listening. And to all my listeners and subscribers, thanks again for your support. And thank you to my special guest, Veronica Kennedy. I'll be back on the 1st of the month with another episode. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to support it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about it, and consider leaving a positive review at iTunes Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, be careful out there and be good to each other.